Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to what I hope is a pretty exciting and rather star-studded debate tonight. Just wait for our speakers to all settle in, and then we shall get going. The motion before the House tonight is this House believes free will does not exist. There's slightly weird feedback from my mic. I hope that doesn't last the course of the debate. Just in terms of format and so on, before we get going, for those of you who are new to our debates in general this term, we have 3 speakers on either side. The empty chair is because one of them tonight is on Zoom. Each speaker has 10 minutes to make their case. They will have a minute at the start and the end as protected time, where you should not stand up and make a point of information, but in the intervening 8 minutes, you may stand up, raise your hand, say on that point of information, or words to that effect, if you believe what they're saying is erroneous or mistaken. I would advise at this point to please keep your points of information relatively short. If we could have 10, 15, 20 seconds and then move on, that would be lovely. You'll have a chance, if you're in the audience tonight and you want to speak on the motion, to make a more extended point as a floor speech. After each round of 2 speakers, we will pause. We will take a 2-minute speech in proposition, abstention, and opposition of the motion, and then we should carry back on with the debate. So there's 2 opportunities to do that. I think that's about it. At the end of the motion, we will ask you to vote through the ayes, abstentions, and the noes doors at the back. But in the meantime, I'd be delighted, rather, to introduce our first speaker for tonight, Dr. Hannah Critchlow. Hannah is a neuroscientist, a writer, a broadcaster, and a fellow of Magdalen College. Her recent book, The Science of Fate, was a Sunday Times bestseller, and in 2019, Hannah was named one of Cambridge University's rising stars in the life sciences. I've also been very correctly told to point out that she has a book on sale tonight outside after the debate. So please come along and get in on that action too. Hannah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'm delighted to be here with you this evening. So have you ever wondered what shaped the person you are today? The decisions that you make, the habits that you hold, how you like to spend your time, with who and where. Even your deeply held beliefs, your ideologies, your identity. What helped to create those? Now, many of us might like to believe that we are masters of our own destiny. But the latest neuroscience findings are challenging that idea and revealing the extent to which our lives might be predetermined. We can now peer into the brain and see how vast swaths of our complex behaviours are biologically ingrained. So this spectacular organ, the brain, contains around 86 billion nerve cells, each one connected to, on average, around 10,000 others, to create the most complicated and intricate circuit board imaginable, with around 86 trillion connections. And some decades ago, a new field of cartography started, mapping not the skies or the oceans or the land, but mapping our minds, creating a wiring diagram for this incredibly intricate circuit board that makes up our brain. And at around the same time, we also started to sequence our DNA. So the 3.2 billion base pairs that makes our unique blueprint for life, carrying the instructions for how our bodies and our brain are put together. And when we read our DNA, what this information is telling us is that there's a high heritability for really complicated behaviors. So, for example, if we look at autism, for example, the heritability for that, so the probability, the difference in the proportion of differences due to genetic variation is around 90%. When we look at schizophrenia, it's 78%. When we look at intelligence, it's estimated to be 56%. When we look at, for example, ideology or belief, estimated to be around 40%, or longevity, how long we live, about 26%. So these really complex behaviors have a high biological underpinning. And in incredible new technology developments, we're now also able to peer into the brain of a baby as the brain is being built. And we can look at this brain at 20 weeks gestation. And what the pioneers, the creators of this technology are telling us is that the babies have this anatomical signature, this fingerprint in their brains that correlates with the genes that predispose for conditions like ADHD or autism, or even those conditions that may not have symptoms that arise for decades down the line. So, for example, schizophrenia or bipolar or major depressive disorder. So those genes that we were talking about earlier that give rise to our complex behaviors, the majority of them are involved in laying down those neural circuits, that electric wiring diagram that makes up our mind. They're involved in dictating how our foundations for thought are created when we're a baby. So are there any other ways that our biological fate, our life stories, might be biologically imprinted into us before we're born? Not through the DNA code per se, but through another route. Well, there's a new field of biology called epigenetics, and we're just starting to discover it. And there's one of my favorite studies in this, now mice usually love the sweet smell of cherries. When a waft of it hits their nose, it'll send an electric signal rushing to the nucleus accumbens, which is the pleasure region of the brain, which lights up, motivating the mice so that it can scurry around in order to hunt out this sweet treat. And what scientists in the States did is that they paired the smell of sweet cherries with a mild electric shock. And when they did this, the mice very quickly learned to freeze in anticipation of the shock. After this not very nice experience, the mice were left to have happy lives. They set up home, had a family, had some pups. The pups left home, had a happy life themselves, and also had children. So now we're talking about the grandchildren of the original mice in the story. And these grandchildren also had this traumatic memory entwined. They were anxious around the smell of cherries as well. So how could that be? How could this memory, this traumatic memory, be transmitted across generations? Well, it turns out there was a change not in the gene itself, not in the DNA code, but in the conformation of the genes, meaning enzymes were accessing the genes in different ways, altering the activity of it. And this altered activity was causing the electric circuit to reroute itself. So it was going not from the nucleus accumbens, but to the amygdala, an area of the brain involved in the fear response. So this is new research, but there's a lot of discussion about how it might have implications for us humans, how our fates might be transmitted from our ancestors through this intertwining of experiences within our biology, embedded within our DNA and its shape. And there's some studies that have looked at, for example, descendants of the US Civil War, civilians, and shown how they've got an 11% higher mortality rate by the mid-40s. Or even descendants of the Holocaust, where there's epigenetic changes in genes involved in cortisol, which is a stress chemical in the brain. So we're increasingly finding, when we look to biology, we're increasingly finding that our fates, our life stories, our personalities, our beliefs, our complex behavioral traits have this hefty biological underpinning. And the more we learn about the brain, the smaller the window, the smaller the space there is for us having any free will. And I'd like to open the discussion with that.
Well, Hannah, thank you ever so much indeed for that. We come now to a term first, at the very least, our first Zoom speaker of term, Daniel Dennett, who hopefully is about to appear via the magic of electricity and technology.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a topic that's dear to my heart.
Philosophy of biology, with emphasis on the problem of free will. He is known as one of the four horsemen of new atheism, along with Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Richard Dawkins. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Imagine that the motion tonight were instead, this House believes that nobody speaks English. I doubt that many people would want to take the affirmative side in that. It would be a sort of frivolous adventure. Because of course you all speak English. Why would you be here otherwise? I want to suggest that tonight's motion is only slightly less frivolous. You weren't born with free will. Free will is a skill. It's something you learned, something you acquired, as the same way you acquired your knowledge of English or your ability to play the violin or to ski or some other activity like that. And you may eventually, if you live long enough and are unfortunate enough, you may end up with senile dementia and you'll lose your free will. Because if you have senile dementia, you're no longer in charge of yourself. You're no longer reliably self-controlled. In my view, the whole topic of free will has been misleading people for several millennia because they confuse control with causation. Think of a boulder tumbling down a mountainside after an earthquake, bouncing down the mountainside hither and yon. Now compare that with a skier racing down the mountain, a good skier. Both trajectories are determined, but only one of them is controlled. The boulder isn't controlled by the forces of nature because there's no feedback. Feedback is the prerequisite for control. That's what control theory is all about. The beautiful thing about human beings is that we have evolved to be good self-controllers. We are the best self-controllers on the face of the planet, and that's why we have free will, and that's why we're safe enough to allow out in public without worrying about the damage we might do. We're much more cautious about our other animal cousins who don't have free will in the same sense we do. And I think here it was Kant who put his finger on one of the best phrases for this. He talked about the ability to be moved by reasons. Now, presumably you came to the Cambridge Union tonight expecting to be moved by reasons. That's what free will fundamentally is, the capacity to adapt your behavior to the reasons you hear. Now, Dr. Critchlow just gave you some lovely examples of epigenetics and the many ways in which we're now learning that our brains have traces of our ancestry that never imagined before. What she didn't point out, but is obvious, I'm sure, to her, and can be obvious to you, is that her very pointing this out to you makes you less susceptible to those changes. Because once you know about them, you can start taking countermeasures against them. That's because you have feedback. That's because you can learn about the forces that act on your own brains, and you can take steps to correct them. I wear eyeglasses. I'm not doomed, predestined. It is not a fatalism fact about me, a fatalistic fact about me that I'm myopic. I can just buy a pair of glasses and restore my sight. Now, the most important thing about free will is that it's not a metaphysical category and it has nothing to do with physics. It's a talent, it's a skill, and it's one that society encourages our parents and our teachers to install in us when we grow up, so that we can be responsible adults, free to move about, to sign contracts, to take responsibility for our actions. If you think you have responsibility for your actions, if you think you are legally competent to sign a contract, then you have free will in the only sense that matters. Now, it's easy enough to define other senses of free will in which you don't have free will for reasons drawn from physics or from neurobiology, for that matter. But those are not important senses. The important sense is the one in which free will is something you have now. You're not responsible for having obtained it. That's just the luck of the draw. Some people, some unfortunates, never manage to achieve free will. You are responsible for protecting your free will now that you're responsible agents. One of your main responsibilities is to avoid others from manipulating you, taking over control. What you want to be is autonomous, which means you don't want to be remotely controlled. Remote control is a perfectly real fact. Our children know about the remote control of the television, for heaven's sakes. Remote control is possible, and it's going to become more possible in the future. Our most important obligation with regard to free will is to take steps to preserve our autonomy in the face of the growing capacity for other controllers, other agents, to maintain control over us. But the past doesn't control you. There's no feedback to the past. The past doesn't control you. The past doesn't control the present. It doesn't control the future. You do, because you are an agent that has the capacity to use feedback to anticipate what's likely to happen and to take steps. Now, are the steps you take determined? Yes, of course. Or they might just as well be, but they're determined by what you know. And that's just what you want. May the facts that are relevant determine my choices. And then I'll be able to make the choices that I want to make. That gives me free will. Now, I said at the outset that you wouldn't be coming to this meeting if you didn't have free will, because you expect to be moved by reasons. That's why you came, to hear my reasons and see if you're moved by them. Now, some people aren't moved by reasons, and they don't have free will, or they don't have much free will. My friend Galen Strawson, who is the next speaker, has sometimes seemed to me to be remarkably impervious to very good reasons that he's unmoved by. So maybe when he speaks on the affirmative that there is no free will, he's speaking about himself. Maybe he doesn't have free will. Maybe all of his motions, speeches, and decisions are not the result of his thinking things through carefully, but just governed by his passions and his hormones and other epigenetic effects. In that case, he is not responsible for what he says and doesn't have free will in the only sense that matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. And may I commend you as well on the black tie for a Zoom. I mean, absolutely spectacular. But just briefly, Hannah, you had a point of information there, and I don't know if it came through. Shall we do that now?
So Daniel, you were talking about capacity for control, and that's what gives us some agency. But I would like to come back to this idea of genetic basis, our hereditary parental DNA that has been given to us. So there's a high heritability for our impulse control. So some people might be able to control themselves slightly more than others. So even our capacity for agency is predetermined. So how do you rectify that?
Well, actually, I'm glad you asked that question, because there's a famous set of experiments, the marshmallow test, which show that although indeed there's high heritability for low self-control, there's also ways, there are in effect eyeglasses for people with low self-control. There are non-invasive techniques of training and education that can improve the self-control of those children who can't pass the marshmallow test. So, as usual, science comes through, it identifies a problem, but it also shows that it's not inevitable. So, it's not inevitable that I am myopic, although it's probably I inherited that from my parents. It's not inevitable that a child got bad self-control, because we can understand enough about the mechanics of self-control to devise workarounds that will aid people in being more in control of their actions than they otherwise would be.
Synaptic plasticity has a high heritability as well.
A small eye on. I mean, we could let this debate run for a million years. Do you want to answer that, and then we'll maybe move on?
She asked about synaptic plasticity. Yes. Well, we're not all alike. Some of us find it much easier to control ourselves than others. Some of us find it easy to do mathematics and others don't. But there is a sort of ceiling effect. Most normal adults are able to maintain enough self-control so that they can be trusted to drive cars on the highway, sign contracts, make promises, own businesses, take care of themselves. And although there's plenty of variation there, and we're learning more and more about it every day, it does not deny us free will. It denies us perfect free will. Galen Strawson speaks about responsibility in the all or nothing sense. No, we don't have responsibility in the all or nothing sense. We don't have free will in the all or nothing sense. So what?
I think we need to move on. What I will do, however, is come. Thank you very much, Daniel, firstly. What I would like to do is come to our first round of floor speeches today. There'll be 2 rounds. You have an opportunity, if you're too scared to speak up now. But would anyone like to speak for 2 minutes tops in proposition of the motion tonight? Raise your hand if so. The person over here who's desperate for a bit, you don't want to speak?
I wanted to say something.
Yeah, okay. In which case, we'll come here. There we go. Name and college, please.
Joe. I'm at Trinity and I study philosophy and I'm a second year. As far as I've observed, there's 2 levels the free will debate happens on. There's the metaphysical level of the case of something like determinism versus indeterminism, which Daniel Dennett famously being a determinist free will proponent, I worry might set the debate that we both agree, that both sides agree that determinism is right and our actions are determined. And to avoid that talking past each other, I would like to perhaps encourage the speakers and the POIs to have on this second front, which is on the assumption, which you could grant for sake of debate, but don't need to commit to, that determinism is right, should we maintain a notion of free will nonetheless? This is a complex question, but I think at least a good reason to suspect why we shouldn't is because it is a very useful mechanism for at least specifically prison reform. The reason for this is because free will is one of the necessary categories for moral responsibility, which in prison reform involves the punishment of retribution, which is the idea of punishment for punishment's sake. Without retribution, you still have deterrent, safety from society, and rehabilitation, which are all consequentialist-based reasons. If you only have these reasons and not just retribution, you get things like shorter prison sentences, more humane prison conditions, and crucially, and this has been demonstrated in some Scandinavian countries and also I believe Portugal for drug-related offenses, lower reoffense rates. So part of what I worry the proposition for believing in free will is afraid of is if we lose free will, we lose moral responsibility, we have an anarchical society. We have some sociological evidence to show that's not going to be the case, and dispelling free will further from our justice system will dispel this notion of moral responsibility and will help reform our prison system and cause lower offense rates, which will cause less victims, which is a tangible consequence of the free will prevalent in society. So we should dispel with it.
And speakers in abstention. One.
Oh, sorry, I wanted to speak.
Whoa. Do you have any speakers you'd like to do? Okay, yes. We'll go here for abstention. Thank you.
I can project.
No. For the live stream.
Okay, my name is Tom Schacht and Phil at Homerton. So I actually think I agree that there are 2 levels. The first is whether or not, you're a libertarian, a determinist, or a compatibilist. But I also think that, free will is a kind of irreducibly Christian concept. And when we get into the kind of compatibilist versus determinist position, you're kind of almost arguing semantics because you're arguing whether or not you're kind of the will travels through the right mental pathways, right? You know, is there a meaningful difference between someone attaching an implant on my neck and, you know, sending electrical signals through my nerves versus me deciding to move my hand and raise my beer? And I think any good determinist would say, oh, that's kind of an irrelevant distinction because all of your will is kind of caused by mental pathways. Your mental pathways are already caused by external causes, so all you're doing is moving it one step up. And I think that's fair, but I think anyone who is a kind of compatibilist is really just being semantic. And the only reason I'm in abstention is because I myself am a Christian, and so I get to kind of do spooky metaphysics and just kick it all up more notches than the determinist. But I really do think that this argument, if you're not going to be a theist, is really just semantics. And I don't think it's that important of a debate if you're doing a compatibilist or determinist position.
There are some very eager opposition speeches tonight. We will come here because he seems very keen. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Name and college, please.
I'm Elliot Leupolz. I'm from Lucy Cavendish. I'm a first-year philosopher. And it's a bit intimidating, having all these, very good, very sort of esteemed philosophers and scientists here. I feel like I'm sort of out of my depth. But, I'm going to make an attempt to give an argument for why, despite determinism, because I accept determinism, but I think that we can still have free will and determinism. And I'd like to make a compatibilist argument here. So, the standard argument for determinism, which I think the proposition sort of scratch that, is basically this idea that, free will is when we could have done otherwise. And that's just a widely accepted definition of what free will is. But then they say, if determinism means that every action is causally necessitated, then, we could never have done otherwise, and therefore no free will. But I'd like to say that I think the definition could have done otherwise is inadequate. It's flawed, because I think the definition has to have some kind of meaning, has to refer to at least something, whether real or imagined. And my problem is that how can we imagine or conceive of this idea of could have done otherwise? What would the universe look like if we could have done otherwise? I don't mean, what would it have been like if I decided to stay at home rather than come to the Cambridge Union tonight? But rather, if our choices aren't causally necessitated, then what are they? Are they random? Are they like a random number generator on a computer? But if our choices are chance, then how free are they? And so, if our choices aren't determined, then what are they? There doesn't seem to be an actual answer to this. So the definition of could have done otherwise is meaningless rubbish. And so therefore, I'd like to sort of propose a different definition. And if you've seen my floor speech in the emergency debate, you can probably tell who I'm going to bring up. I think we should, look to a certain philosopher who went to Cambridge once, known as Thomas Hobbes, who says, "A free man is he that in those things which by his strength and wit he is able to do is not hindered to do what he has a will to do." And then he goes on to say, no liberty can, from the use of the word free will, no liberty can be inferred to the will, desire, or inclination, but the liberty of the man, which consisteth in this, that he finds no stop in doing what he has the will, desire, or inclination to do. And I think this is, if we're sort of conceiving of free will in this way, then I think, we do have free will. Well, we can have free will, because obviously, you can. Thomas Hobbes is saying, people can stop us. We can be stopped by, the laws of physics. If I can't just say I want to fly, I don't have the free will to fly. But, I have the free will to stand here and give a speech at this union, and so I do have free will. I don't have the free will to, run across the roads and drive or cycle dangerously, because that'd be against the law. But I have the free will to give my speech here, and so I think we should look at. I think this is my. Okay, I'm done here, but yes, my compatibilist argument for free will, and more Thomas Hobbes's, but thank you.
And may I thank you for making sure that my term did not go without a mention of Thomas Hobbes. I'm very pleased to hear it. Right, also, can I just make a general point? Next time someone uses a long and complicated word, can they also explain what it means? Because I'm sat here trying to follow along, and then someone mentioned I don't know what that is. Just as a general plea. Our second proposition speaker tonight is Noes. He is a professor of cognitive and computational neuroscience at the University of Sussex, where he is also co-director of the Sackler Centre for Consciousness Science. His new book, Being You, is also on sale tonight. And I've got some lovely things to say about it here. It's an instant Sunday Times bestseller, a Guardian Book of the Week, a Financial Times Book of the Year. So he's only brought 6 copies, so it's a first come, first served. We have to pay, but like, run, buy them as soon as you can. Anil, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was a student at King's 30 years ago, and of course, therefore, I never came to the union at that time. Also, I'm kind of embarrassed. Daniel Dennett, one of my mentors, whose book Consciousness Explained I read as an undergraduate here, which kindled my interest in consciousness at that time, managed to wear the appropriate clothes. And I have singularly failed in that already. But I wanted to start actually by responding to something that Dan said in his remote presentation, which is that I can agree with him that we as biological agents have a competence to control our complex biology. We have degrees of freedom, as he puts it. We have the ability to do many different things, and our brains are very good at executing that control. We are sensitive to feedback from the environment, and we are moved by evidence and reasons, and that is all completely fine. But I think Dan has also engaged in what he himself calls out sometimes as a bait and switch, right? When you talk about that, being sensitive to reasons, being engaging in complex control, actually that's not what most people mean by free will. What most people mean by free will, and what the proposition of the House is today, is something else. It's the feeling that the self has a causal role in making things happen in the world. In the words of one of my other speakers tonight, Galen Strawson, there's a feeling of radical, absolute buck-stopping up to meanness in choice and action. When I experience freely willing an action, I am experiencing myself as causing that action. The contents of experiences like these, let's call them experiences of volition, are philosophically disorienting in a really weird and pernicious way, perhaps more than any other kind of experience. Experiences of volition fuel intuitions of dualism, that consciousness, or at least conscious selfhood, is somehow something apart from the material world that nonetheless has causal impact on that material world. And this is the kind of free will that I think does not exist. It's spooky free will, some people might call it libertarian free will. It's the natural endpoint of mistakenly interpreting experiences of volition as transparent windows into the causal structure of the universe, confusing how things seem with how they are. It's the notion of free will as some sort of strategically savvy, uncaused cause that intervenes in the flow of physical events in the universe, making things happen that wouldn't otherwise happen. And this dualistically pumped up variety of free will, where there's a separation between matter and mind, demands freedom from the laws of cause and effect, and offers nothing in return. And when you take that kind of free will, spooky free will off the table, interestingly, we can retire, to Joe from the floor's point, we can retire this debate about determinism. It really doesn't matter. For spooky free will, it does matter. If determinism is true, well, how does spooky free will intervene and make something happen that wouldn't otherwise happen? But if it's false, you might think there's some elbow room for free will to go in and do its business, but that doesn't really help either. It explains nothing because it requires this uncaused cause to do the intervening and to be strategically savvy enough to know how and why and when to intervene so that the organism does the right thing at the right time. So it doesn't matter whether the universe is deterministic or not. Although spooky free will does not exist, certainly experiences of volition do exist, and they are extremely useful for the organism. But instead of directly revealing the causal fabric of the universe, they are varieties, I argue, of self-related perception that are intimately and constitutively associated with voluntary actions. And these kinds of perception, when we perceive the world, our brain is inferring what's going on out there in the world. I see colors. My brain projects that objects have colors in the world, and they seem real. In the same way, when I experience volition, it seems that the experience is causally implicated in the action. But it's just another kind of perception, one that has to do with the self. And from this perspective, whether determinism is true or false doesn't matter at all. There's no need to disrupt the causal flow of physical events in the universe. Let me say a bit more about what it means to think of experiences of volition as a kind of perception. what it means is that there's a continuity, an important continuity between these sorts of experiences of intending to do something and all of our experiences, whether they're of objects or colors or people or places. And all our experiences can be thought of as the brain meeting sensory information with its predictions about the causes of that sensory information. All our perceptions are kind of controlled hallucinations, perceptual best guesses about the way the world is. Now, if we think about our experiences of the world around us, we think of things like objects and spatial arrangements and colors and shapes and all that. There are three defining features to our experiences of volition. Firstly is this feeling that I am doing what I want to do. When I voluntarily decide to make a cup of tea, that's because making tea is aligned with my beliefs and desires, even though I didn't choose to have these beliefs and desires. The second is the feeling that I could have done otherwise, as pointed out by the gentleman from Lucy Cavendish. When I decided to make tea, part of that experience is the experience that I could have made coffee if I wanted to, but that doesn't actually mean I could have made coffee. If you replay the same tape twice, you get the same outcome, apart from boring differences due to randomness. The nature of the experience, the feeling that I could have done otherwise, is not an insight into how the universe causally unfolds. The third defining feature is that voluntary actions seem to come from within.
The brain perceives things, and I think you used the word hallucinates or builds an illusion of perceptions, and then it maps out predictions. After the brain has a prediction, what does the brain do then?
The brain is always everything you experience in that view is a prediction already. Predictions don't have to be about the future; they can be about the here and now. Well, that's the nature of what you perceive. It's nothing to do with decision. Even the experience of seeing the color red is your brain predicting how light reflects off surfaces. That's a prediction made by the brain. You yourself need not be aware of it, but that's the kind of prediction that the brain is making its best guess about what caused sensory information. So there is this third defining feature that voluntary actions seem to come from within rather than being imposed from elsewhere. That's the difference between a reflexive action and the feeling I get when I deliberately try to do something like kick a ball. And so altogether, when we perceive an action as being voluntary, as being freely willed, what's happening is that we're inferring that the causes of some action emanating from the organism come largely from within in a way that's detached from alternative possible causes, and that is accompanied by the suggestion of potentially doing otherwise. So you experience an action as voluntary when you perceptually infer that you caused that action. And who is this you? Is this some other cause behind all this? No, the you itself is just another form of perception. It's a collection of perceptions, prior beliefs, values, goals, memories, perceptions of the body that collectively make up the experience of who you are, of which experiences of volition are themselves a part. And what's more, all actions can be understood also as kinds of perceptions. I move my hand, it's a perceptual prediction of where my body is going to be. So experiences of volition are both consistent with what we do when we make voluntary actions, but they also are implicated in bringing about those voluntary actions in a way that doesn't require any weird immaterial cause. They're purely consistent with what the brain is doing when it's perceiving actions as coming largely from within. And thinking about it this way, an experience of volition or intention is just as real as, let's say, a visual experience of color. Neither corresponds to a definite property of the universe. There's no real blue or red out there, just that there's no actual free will in here. But they both contribute to guiding our behavior, and both are constrained by prior beliefs, the things that we inherit and the things that we learn from day to day, and the previous experiences you've just had, and by sensory data. And whereas experiences of color, for instance, construct features of the world around us, experiences of volition have the metaphysically subversive content that the experience is causing the action. We project causal power into our experiences of volition in just the same way that we project redness into our perceptions of surfaces. 1 minute, good. And in the same way that experiences of color are useful for the organism, So are experiences of volition. Indeed, these experiences are indispensable for us. They are self-fulfilling perceptual inferences that bring about voluntary actions. Without them, we would not be able to muster the responses that allow us to navigate complex environments, nor could we learn from previous experiences. Here, the usefulness of feeling I could have done differently is not that you could actually have done differently, it's that next time you might. So to close, there is no free will in the sense of soul-powered magic nonsense that demands freedom from the laws of nature or from the causal fabric of the universe. What remains, and this might be like Hobbes, what remains is the freedom to act according to our beliefs, values, and goals, to do as we wish to do, and to make choices and think thoughts according to who we are. And that is enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anil, for a wonderful speech. We will come now to our second opposition speaker for tonight. Dr. Philip Ball is a science writer who has written books on topics as disparate as the nature of water, colour in art, the cognition of music, and the science of political philosophy. Having trained as a chemist and a physicist, he was previously editor of the journal Nature for over 20 years and contributes frequently to the New Scientist, New York Times, The Guardian, and Financial Times. Philip, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, there are two common and easy ways to make a case for this motion. We've heard a little bit about both of them already. The first is to say that the only thing that qualifies as free will is a force outside everything we know about in the physical world that somehow intervenes in it to move matter and make things happen. In other words, to make free will supernatural. The second is to assert that will is only free if nothing constrains it, not our history, not our genes, not our circumstances. I'm sure you'll see straight away how the second argument just doesn't cut it. That I've chosen to ignore the black tie convention, as did Anil tonight, but not the convention to be clothed at all, says only that my free will works in this matter within limits, as surely it always does. Dan has his pajama trousers on, by the way. I don't know what that says about his free will, but maybe we can think about it. What about the first argument? This argument that is essentially the determinist argument. To make free will supernatural is the tactic of hard determinism. And the idea here is that everything follows inevitably from their antecedent state via blind physical forces between particles. There is no room for free will in physics. Today, we must qualify that argument because there seems to be an irreducible indeterminacy in quantum physics, but this sprinkling of randomness can't rescue free will either. This defense, the defense of free will that we've heard about already, known as compatibilism, accepts this description of physics, that is, and so do I. To that extent, my position is compatibilist. But the reason free will survives this challenge from microphysics is, I believe, compelled by physics itself, and hopefully leads us somewhere useful. You see, if we're serious about producing from a reductionist, deterministic viewpoint, anything like an explanation for why things happen as they do, we find that we're forced into a one-to-one account, a mapping of our account onto everything that happens. Not then an explanation, in fact, at all, but a description, and an impossibly exhaustive one at that. I raise my arm. Why? The answer is not provided by the configuration of all my particles in the instant before I raised it. All that says is that I'm made of particles. It's devoid of explanatory content. We must ask why these particles in this configuration in the Cambridge Union tonight. That explanation must account for why my brain was configured this way at this moment, which must then acknowledge my surroundings, including all of you. It must acknowledge my history, indeed my and your entire evolutionary history. And in fact, it's not clear which parts of all cosmic evolution we can then leave out. So the alternative to an explanation of why I raised my hand or my arm that does not invoke our choices as autonomous agents in convening these atoms here and now is one that must encompass essentially all microphysical events, back at least to the quantum fluctuations that dictated the large-scale structure of the universe, which is merely to say that this thing happened, and so did all things before it. In short, an explanation from microphysics demands too much, because then we no longer know where to look. Or rather, it's because hard determinism is seeking an answer for behavior in the wrong place. It's precisely because causation for my behavior doesn't meaningfully reside at the level of my particles that we don't know where to stop searching for it there. Causation in this case requires and derives from a higher level description. And this is not a mystery, nor is it just an assertion. That causation may reside at the higher levels of a complex system is well established. And physics has always recognized this. Water doesn't freeze because the water molecules have decided to, neither because they cause it to. Freezing is an irreducibly collective phenomenon. It's not something that individual water molecules do. It's not part of their ontology. Clearly, that doesn't mean freezing is not real. Choice is not something that atoms do, nor even neurons. That doesn't mean it's not real. The Nobel laureate physicist Philip Anderson explained this in 1972 when he said, the behavior of large and complex aggregates of elementary particles is not to be understood in terms of a simple extrapolation of the properties of a few particles. Instead, at each level of complexity, entirely new properties appear, and the understanding of the new behaviors requires research which is as fundamental in its nature as any other. Psychology is not applied biology, nor is biology applied chemistry. And it's not simply that these higher level properties are some convenient coarse graining of all the microphysical details. Rather, they are the true causal source of the events we see. And this has been clarified in recent work by physicists at the University of Vienna. They showed formally what probably intuition tells us already, that to talk meaningfully about a cause or source of a complex event like a human decision, it's no good pulling the system apart into its fundamental constituents, because you only will have to put it all back together again with an explicit representation of all your thoughts and emotions and memories and all the rest. In other words, reductionist hard determinism is a pointless detour. The proper place to look for an explanation of volitional actions and decisions is the one we've heard about already. It's at the neuroscientific and the cognitive level. Well, the common way to attack free will in that arena is to say, it's not you who chose, your brain made you do it. The settings of your brain forced you to make the decision as you did, to which one has to respond, but of course they did. What else, if you're not a Cartesian dualist, what else could have done so? The settings in your brain is precisely what we're talking about. That is you, with all your innate tendencies, memories, experiences, and feelings. The question of whether it means anything to dismantle that you into deeper causal factors, the question is whether that means anything. And here again, it's about finding the appropriate level for considering the causal origins of behavior. And that's not atoms, that's not even neurons, it's the brain circuitry. As it functions. Okay, accepted.
You use the phrase true cause to describe the cognitive level. If you acknowledge that what happens at the cognitive level is causally determined by the level beneath it, such as the surrounding, what do you mean by true cause?
I'm saying it's not causally determined by the lower levels, and it's possible to show this. The level of causal information in those lower levels in a complex system is very little, close to zero. If you want to talk about cause, in some situations like this, you have to look at the higher levels of the problem. That is where the causal information resides. Yes.
Are you not confusing supervenience with causation here?
No, I don't think so, because if we are going to, we tell a story, cause and effect, we tell a story about it. The meaningful story that we can tell has to come from those higher levels. I don't think you can tell a meaningful story about cause from my atoms. I don't think you can even do that from my neurons. When you get to my brain circuitry, perhaps, then we're in business. And what neuroscience tells us in that regard is revealing, because we know a fair amount now, as the other speakers have said, about the decision-making circuits of the brain, not least that they exist at all. In fact, there seem to be different brain circuits involved in determining actions depending on whether they're automatic reflex actions, like the knee jerk when your knee is tapped, or ones that seem to us to involve volition, where the impulse to act has to come from within. Why, if all the brain is ever doing is responding in a machine-like way to how the environment has programmed it, thank you, why then would evolution have given us distinct neural hardware that looks so perfectly suited to making spontaneous decisions informed by the relevant data? No, the brain is designed by natural selection to be self-determining, to generate its own reasons for action when the occasion demands. We see that in its architecture, and in any case, that's what brains are for. What really matters then in thinking about cause is not what will happen if we're thinking about future events, or not what caused things to happen in the past, but rather what makes what happens happen. That's the question. And if that causal explanation demands a representation of you as an autonomous agent, and I argue that both physics and neuroscience tells us that it does, then we need and should demand nothing more of free will. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a wonderful speech. We will come now to our next round of floor speeches. Just very quick, what side do you want to go on? What side are you on? Prop. We do have a sort of seventh speaker, in a way, tonight. Is that the right? Yes. We will go to Alex first, I believe.
Does that mean I get to say that I've spoken at the Cambridge Union?
Yeah, it does mean you get to say
Fantastic.
that.
Yes, hello. Alex O'Connor, St John's College, Oxford. I'm sorry, I've been very grateful for how hospitably I've been welcomed into the second best debating society in the country. It's been great. I wanted to respond briefly directly to the previous floor speech, actually. I found it quite interesting that the speech essentially went something like, look, there's this idea we have a free will, the ability to have acted differently, that sounds about right. But look, if we think about what this idea means, the ability to have acted differently, the universe would have had to have its atoms moving in different directions and all of this kind of stuff. That just doesn't really make any sense. Well, yeah, that's kind of the point, it seems. If you want to then say, well, okay, why don't we take a different definition of free will than that is conceptually imaginable, that's fine, but then I think you're committing the kind of bait and switch that we heard about earlier. If the argument goes something like, we have this functional definition of free will, and of course it's going to be arbitrary how you define it, just define your terms and debate the terms on those grounds, but if that's what most people mean by free will, and I think that it probably is, then to say something like, well, that doesn't conceptually make sense, and so we have to search for another definition, maybe we should just say it doesn't conceptually make sense, full stop. I also found it interesting that Dr. Dennett mentioned earlier that we all came here in the anticipation of being moved by reason. Interesting choice of phrasing there. Moved by reason. What's doing the moving? It's not you, it's the reason. That's precisely the point. If I present to you an argument that you find compelling, and I present the stages of the reasoning, and every single stage you just grant your assent, you don't choose to do that. You're either convinced or you're not. You don't get to decide whether you're convinced by something. You just are or you're not. And so yes, you come here and somebody puts forward an argument and then you find out if you're moved by that reasoning or not. You don't decide whether you're moved by that reasoning. You find out. And if you are, you are. And if you're not, you're not. And if you don't believe me, then if you are on proposition right now, I invite you to just try it out for a minute. Try to just be convinced by the other side, just for a minute. That's not how it works. You're either convinced or you're not. There's no choice in the matter. And so I found it quite fascinating that that was the choice of phrasing that Dr. Dennett used, because I think it, more than anything, emphasizes the point of the proposition, which is that reason moves you and not the other way around.
it feels a little bit unfair to give the Cosmic Skeptic a floor speech, so I will do a round of 3 proper student floor speeches as well, which means we will take one in proposition of the motion from the floor, and we'll go here, if that works. Stand up.
Hello. Yeah, hi, this
Name
is
and
Kate.
college, please. Yes.
I'm from Wolfson College, and I'm going to speak in proposition about something that I don't know a whole lot about, but I think it will benefit you to hear me out. So I want to go back a little farther than Thomas Hobbes and introduce the Buddha. The Buddha did not believe in a conception of free will, and of course, Buddhism is a very heterogeneous faith, and there are many different interpretations, and mine is just one of them. But he still defended choice, responsibility, and personal retribution. How exactly did he do this? One of the major themes within the Buddhist tradition is called dependent origination, where basically each volition is a conditioned action by the past, and hence it's not free to begin with in the way that we might understand free will. One of the speakers earlier talked about free action as similar to the experience of volition, and that's similarly what Buddha would claim to be what we experience as free will, as an experience of volition, but actually conditioned by the past. And in fact, this echoes in one of his quotes where he says, "Those who have known causation know the dharma." Here, Buddha is claiming that those who know the causal existence know the truth. But then that begs the question, what does one do with the truth? And that's where Buddha offers another answer in the form of becoming mindful, that is, being aware of the effects that our actions have on others and on ourselves. And yet I claim that the Buddha did not believe in free will, because that mindfulness, blah, 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 requires some notion of free will. But actually, it does not, because background to the question of free will is will of who. And here, the self, which is the presupposition for European philosophers in the kind of understanding of free will, it's simply absent in Buddhism. And the reason that this holds is actually interesting, because Buddha, like the Greeks, like the Romans, and like Wittgenstein, who was once in Cambridge, did not distinguish the inner and the outer that produces the tension between internal freedom and external causality. He saw them as one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For speeches in absence, people have started putting their hands up before I even say what's coming on. And the keenest hand is definitely this one.
I am so nervous right now. Yeah, my name is Dhruv Makwana. I'm at Trinity College. I'm a computer science PhD student, and I'm a novice speaker, debater, philosopher. And not only do I have to follow Daniel Dennett, I have to follow one of my biggest idols, Cosmic Skeptic. I am so nervous right now. But I'm also glad that I'm in this position, right? Because I followed Kate Tanha, who wonderfully articulated a few thoughts about Buddhism, which means I don't need to go into much detail about it. I might offer a synthesis or an explanation of the two sides of this debate. I'm not sure if my argument counts for or against. I leave the audience to judge that for themselves. There are 5 independent lines of thought that I've come across which show that there's no essence, no soul, no Cartesian ego to an individual. Starting with Eastern thought, with the Buddha and the teaching of anatta. In neuroscience, the mental activity of the brain has been akin to a jazz band, not an orchestra with a conductor. In Western thought, the lines of Hume and Parfit have arrived at this conclusion fairly independently. In the physics of time, as articulated by physicist Carlo Rovelli in his wonderful poetic book, The Order of Time, he talks about only timeless quantum interaction, where macroscopic things such as you and I are only present or only understood through the ignorance of details, a statistical blurring, what we call entropy. And I invite everyone in this room to pursue this last line of inquiry into the teaching of no self, which is direct experience. And this is not an easy path to pursue. It takes time and effort and dedication. If you develop your attention to a refined and quick enough level, you will see one phenomena, one by one, as they occurred. That is Sariputta in the Majjhima Nikaya, in the Anapada Sutta. Phenomena including, as Professor Seth mentioned, volitional mental activities and your sense of self. And as Kate mentioned, these are all subject to cause and effect. So if there's no center to experience, there's no seer, there's no listener, no doer. It is a complex interplay. When my friend Jamie asked me who was forcing me to go to this debate, I simply replied, there is no who, there is no me. What is there to be free? But I don't simply offer a deconstruction of the self, I offer a reconstruction too. How do we have a sense of self? Well, it is the same, and I don't have too much time to go into detail, way that we experience time. It is through ignorance of the detail. It is through ignorance of our full range of sensory experience. As Professor Saib mentioned earlier, the boring random differences. But these boring random differences are precisely what makes our experience our experience. And I can give you an example. We saw Daniel Dennett speaking earlier, and there was motion, right? Everyone agrees that there were motion on the projector. Does that mean there's something moving? Think about it. Does motion entail a mover? Does sound entail a speaker? Does sight entail a seer? Well, there's two levels at which this question can be answered. At the macroscopic level, obviously. But at the microscopic level, all the projector was doing was changing particular configurations on pixels. So if you zoomed in, you would not see a mover. If you zoom out, the mover appears. So I'll just quote Spinoza. Agency appears when we truncate a full description. It is the boundary of the causal closure of the approximate description, right? We just decide to draw a boundary around some mental events and exclude other based on some criteria. Approximate descriptions turn into explanations and reasons, as was mentioned earlier. So how can both be true? Well, we have no reason to privilege one level of reality over another. Both can be true simultaneously. The bait and switch, as occurred, mentions between zooming in and zooming out. In the Rig Veda, and frequently in the Madhyamaka Buddhism of Nagarjuna, there's a logical system which has at least 4 values: true, false, both, and neither. This has been formalized by the logician Graham Priest. So I abstain because I think both sides are right. Whilst the quantum or the neural world might be predetermined, that still lives our macroscopic world unknown and free. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you have anyone who would like to speak in opposition? You've had a POI, so I feel like it probably tempted to go here at the back.
Hello, Alvin, Corpus Christi. So I'd like to say, just in a manner sort of inspired slightly by Wittgenstein, but concepts exist because they're useful. And I actually do agree with many of the sentiments expressed before that in a way is sort of a semantic debate. It's one caused by a supernatural debate about the soul sort of being debated in sort of very secular terms. But I still argue from quite a compatibilist point of view that it's very difficult not to think of free will, or at least that, although it's a confusing term, that we haven't really invented better alternatives. I think free will exists because for many applications that have been mentioned earlier, like for understanding neuroscience, for understanding personal responsibility, the law, etc., free will is actually very hard not to use. I agree that it's confusing in the way that some people may use it in a spooky or supernatural setting, in which I don't believe in. But I do think that the existing alternatives, like saying willpower, saying they don't entirely account for sort of the conscious experience of free will, which is quite useful and which at least some people think of in the word. So I would say either free will exists or we might have to invent it.
Thank you very much, everyone. We will come now to our third speaker for the proposition tonight. Professor Gillian Strawson has been mentioned already and is an analytic philosopher and literary critic. He currently holds the chair in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Texas. Gillian, the floor is yours, although that is the wrong side, so you want to go over there.
Thanks. Hello. Can you hear me? Good. Well, I was here 50 years ago, and like Anil Seth, I also never set foot in this spindling. But that's because I was just growing my hair and smoking weed. So, and my total philosophy career was from November to the end of April before the finals, because I caught hepatitis in Syria and didn't get back till November of my 4th year. So, I want to do 5 things. If I run out of time, you'll tell me. Okay, so first I want to say which notion of free will I'm going to talk about. I think it's the one that's the really troublesome one. So I'll tell you what that is. Then I'll prove that it doesn't exist. Then I'll show you why you can't help believing in it. Then I'll have to bring up the argument from Hitler, because it always happens. And yeah. Then I'll probably slightly distance myself from my co-proponents, if proponents is the right noun for the although I totally admire and love everything they do and think it's all true. In fact, I'm sure it's all true. And then I might even sidle up a little bit to the other side. Okay, that's it. So the notion of free will that I'm concerned with, prime ministerial fumble going on here. I get 21 seconds to find my place. If you remember, did you see the Prime Minister the other day? No, okay. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the use of the word free will, the phrase free will, which is used in many different ways, that lies at the heart of the problem. This is quite simply the use that's meant to mean that we're ultimately morally responsible for what we do, in such a way that it can be ultimately just or fair to punish us when we do something bad. That's the thing that really most people care about and most people believe in. Okay, let's get determinism out of the way first. So determinism is the view that nothing can ever happen otherwise than it does, so that if it's true, all your actions were already fixed at the Big Bang, and it seems pretty clear in that case that you can't be ultimately morally responsible for what you do. Some people think that science has shown that determinism isn't true, but this just isn't so. I mean, it's actually provably unprovable, for one thing, and I think it might well be so, but it doesn't matter. In fact, two people have already said that determinism just doesn't matter. Really, it makes no difference. Okay, so now here goes, let me think. So here's the argument that proves that it's not possible. The stuff that matters, the stuff that you'd have to have if you were to be ultimately morally responsible. Premise one, you do what you do because of the way you are. You do what you do in the situation you're in because of the way you then are. Premise two, well then, to be ultimately responsible for what you do, you're going to have to be ultimately responsible for the way you are. Premise three, but you can't be ultimately responsible for the way you do. Conclusion, so you can't be ultimately responsible. You can't be ultimately responsible for the way you are, for many reasons, including all the reasons about genetics and early upbringing. So conclusion, you can't be truly responsible for what you do. Well, why can't you be ultimately responsible for how you are? Because to be ultimately responsible for how you are, you'd have to have somehow set it up that you are the way you are. But for you to be able to do that, you'd have to exist already with a certain outlook in order to be someone who could set themselves up to be the way they were. But then, what about that person who just set up the person you are? You'd have to set them up. And so you get an infinite regress. And an infinite regress means it's something that isn't possible. Okay. So that's why ultimate moral responsibility isn't possible. And notice this argument is, as philosophers say, a priori. It has absolutely nothing, science has nothing to say, it doesn't matter. Okay, now I'm going to try to show you that you can't help believing in the very kind of free will that I said isn't possible. And all I have is a very simple story. And I tell you, it's an undramatic story, and I choose that because dramatic stories can kind of twist people's emotions in ways. So here's the story. It's the evening before a national holiday. You've made your preparations, your family's coming tomorrow, and you look at the table, you think, there's only one more thing I really need, and that's a big cake to make things really nice. So you decide to go out to the shop with your last £20 note. You get to the shop's about to close, there's one cake left in the shop and it costs £20. But on the steps of the shop, there is somebody holding an Oxfam box. And you've got good food at home. And at this point, you experientially know, I'm saying no, although that you are absolutely radically free to choose either to go in and buy the cake or to put the money in the Oxfam box. As it were, the existential situation is that you cannot live that choice as absolutely free. You may have done some philosophy, and you may think to yourself now that you'll be able to turn around in 5 minutes' time and look back on what you did and say, well, I was bound to do that. You know that now, but even that doesn't change the fact that you experience this as radical freedom. So Jean-Paul Sartre has a more dramatic example, famous example about whether the man should go off and fight in the French resistance or stay at home to look after his ailing mother. But I just like the simple story. So after hearing that story, the radical freedom you know you have as you stand in the doorway of the shop with the Oxfam box there and the cake there, you may say, oh, sure, see, I don't have to be ultimately responsible for how I am in order to be ultimately responsible for how what I do. Well, that's intensely natural, but I think it just doesn't work. For whatever you do choose at the door of the shop, it will flow from how you then are, which will be something for which you are in no way ultimately responsible. And it's at this point that someone always brings up Hitler. Actually, I had to go on a program called The Moral Maze. It was the 666th episode, and it was meant to be about evil. But all that happened was that when I went on it was I just got hit with questions about free will. And Michael Burke was running it, and he said, what about Hitler? And all I could really say was, that's just not the best way to start. This is the argument from Hitler, and it says, what about Hitler? If you're right, he isn't ultimately responsible for what he did, but obviously he is a monster. And whatever word worse than the monster you want. Well, I'm afraid the argument applies to him too. I never said I liked the argument or the conclusion. But this is how it is. You can't reject a conclusion simply because you don't like it or find it repugnant. Okay, next thing is, as I said, I agree with everything that my co-proponents said. But it struck me as all that neuroscience has become, it's become the trigger for programs and things about free will so often these days, because we philosophers, we have these powerful conceptual tools, which is why we annoy scientists so much. And as I said, the argument I gave doesn't matter. So means that none of these conclusions matter, although they're all true, and although they're entirely consistent with and support the general line that I'm taking. And here's a simple way to show this. Suppose we had immaterial souls, good old-fashioned Cartesian immaterial souls. Well, would that help? Absolutely not, because the same argument would start all over again. You got a soul. Oh, where did it come from? Who set it up? Did you make yourself to be the way you are as an immaterial self? Well, then you'd have to have existed already before in order to set yourself up, and then you go back on the infinite regress again. So, okay, well, I don't want to subvert the whole debate, but I should say that I don't think the philosophers among us really disagree. I don't know about Dan, but we are old philosophical enemies. But although, actually, we totally agree on religion and Darwin and everything. 1 minute. But I think I probably don't disagree with anything Simon might say. I'm not trying to undercut. The bottom line is think of the old story of heaven and hell. Reward in heaven or punishment in hell. Could never be just or fair. That's it. Okay.
Thank you, Galen, for a speech that took several years off my life expectancy. We come now, at last, to Simon Blackburn, who is an academic philosopher best known for his work on meta-ethics, as well as for the many influential books he has written for a popular audience. He is a Fellow of Trinity College and Professor at the New College of the Humanities. Simon, the floor is yours.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much. I think the last time I was here, I was debating the issue of whether this house learns more from philosophy than rap. I had to be on the side of the philosophers, of course, and we lost. So I hope this doesn't repeat the exercise. I agree with almost everything that's been said. I love physics. I love neuroscience, such as I know of it. I don't love Cartesian souls and spooks, and for the reason that Galen just adumbrated, they won't help. Because whatever dilemmas of determinism and randomness apply to us would apply to the spooks within us, so they're just going to raise the same questions. So we are what we are. We are large living animals made of tissue, made of things which presumably obey the laws of nature, good thing too, and thus we arrive, and thus we are. So where's free will in all that? Well, as many speakers have said, it depends on what you mean by free will. If it means freedom from all previous influences, no, but neither do you want it. I'm not free to speak Chinese to you because I've never learnt Chinese. I am free to speak English to you because I've learnt to speak English. Those are facts about my past, and it's those facts about my past that give me my capacities and, of course, my limitations. There's no doubt I have limitations. I have obvious ones. I can't leap up to that balcony, but I no doubt have others. They're things that I'm too cowardly or timid or too much a creature of my habits to undertake, and no amount of, or very huge amounts of incentive and cajolement wouldn't enable me to undertake them. It's just not within my nature, as we may say. And that nature, as all speakers, I think, have emphasized, isn't one that I chose. It's one that I largely inherited, I grew up with. If it wasn't genetics, it was environment, it was epigenetics, and so on. So let's not deny any of that, and let's go into it, not go into it. I'm not going to talk about Hitler, but I would like to go back to something a gentleman down here said, which was that the denial of freedom can be a morally liberating thing. That is, you stop regarding people who transgress as criminals, as deserving punishment, as deserving to be put into prison. We all know that doesn't work. It's a very ineffective kind of social control. And we could be brought to feel that it's actually inappropriate. There's something wrong about treating people in that way. But this is a two-sided coin, or two-edged sword, if you like. Galen, who spoke so eloquently, Galen's father, Sir Peter Strawson, you haven't been knighted yet, have you, Galen? Galen's father, Sir Peter Strawson, great philosopher, wrote a famous paper in 1950-something called Freedom and Resentment. 62? Okay, 62. And in it, he drew attention to two very different attitudes we can have to each other, to human beings and to ourselves. One is the objective attitude. We see ourselves as it were, aspects of nature, things that happen. You are something that happens. If you are annoying or bad or somehow in my way, I could regard you in the way that I'd regard another obstacle, the weeds in my garden or something. They're to be managed or controlled, altered, weeded out, perhaps. That's the objective attitude to each other. Strawson contrasted it with the reactive, or in a way, the human attitude to each other, which is that I would regard you as somebody who can listen to reason, who might want to take my views into account, who I can talk to, who perhaps I can love or hate. These reactive attitudes, he thought, were essential to human life. If you can't look other people in the eye and say, you are like me, you can listen to these reasons, you can be responsive to the things I say, then I'm objectifying you. I'm regarding you as a patient or something. Now, I think modern life, possibly aided by confused thoughts about free will and many of the confusions we've been hearing about, is very apt to prioritize the objective attitude at the expense of the human attitude. Well, I said I wasn't going to talk about Hitler, but this summer I went to Poland with our son, who lives in the United States and was in Europe for the first time for nearly 2 years. And from Krakow, we went to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And there you see the result of the objectifying attitude. For the Nazis, the Jews were things to be managed or handled or cured or trained or killed. That was the architecture of Auschwitz-Birkenau. That's the result of a dehumanizing attitude. The Nazis enabled themselves, I think it was a self-conviction, it was a kind of fantasy that they'd indulged and learnt from each other, rather like anti-vax movements in current times, that Jews were not human. They weren't to be listened to. They weren't to be reasoned with. Their voices were not to be heard. They were to be managed, which in this case meant the final solution. It's one of the most desperate examples of an ideology, which means a philosophy, because ideology is just philosophy gone wrong, having this inhuman outcome. And if you can't see or listen to and react to human beings as human beings, then that's what results. And we all should be on our guard against that. The free will debate can be confined to the level of metaphysics, confined to the level of determinism, indeterminism, neurophysiology, physics, emergent properties, causal laws, and so on. And that's fine. That's an academic exercise, and we've heard a great many of its very proper movements. But there's a moral aspect to it. The gentleman who talked was right, that it can be, in a sense, wrong to demonize people, to regard them as needing punishment. It can be, but it can also be wrong to regard them as inhuman, to regard them as having no voice. Many of you have had parents who, during your teenage years, wouldn't listen to your voice. They regarded you as a problem. Teenagers are a problem, let's face it. But you also had a voice. And if your voice wasn't heard, you would feel resentful, you would feel dissed, as they say. And you were right to, because your humanity was being impugned. And
are you saying that free will requires the recognition that one has free will?
it requires the recognition of other people as human, as participants in conversations, as participants in a human life we can live together. And if you lose that, you lose everything. So I want you to concentrate on the moral aspects of this debate. And remember, you may not have been to Auschwitz-Birkenau. It's the most frightening experience. And if you haven't, well, some of you might want to thank God you haven't. But if you haven't, remember what it can come to. Thank you.
thank you very much, Simon. That brings us to an end of tonight's debate. Before we go, there are a couple of pieces of admin. Firstly, I'm really pleased that there were some new people today doing floor speeches, and I would encourage you all to get involved, even if you do feel nervous, to come and speak, because I think it's really important that we get lots of fresh faces doing exactly that. Before you leave tonight, remember that there is a Noes door, an eyes door, and if you're downstairs, an abstention door. I will be announcing the result of tonight's debate in the bar in 10, 15, 20 minutes' time, so come and join us for a continuation of the debate. And remember, Jordan Peterson is tomorrow, Stephen Fry is Friday, and Andrew Bailey is on Thursday. Thank you very much.